Hello and good morning, everybody, to day number 4 of webinar week number 2 here with Beyond Pulse. We're back to our player series today, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Mr. Chris Casper, who you can see with us, and of course Mr. Mark Wilson. So in a moment, I'm going to let Chris introduce himself and explain his background in the game and why we're so fortunate to have him here with us today. What I would like to say, for the benefit of anybody just joining, there are a couple of technology issues here, so if you can be super diligent with keeping your microphones off and your webcams off, both myself and Mark will do the same with our mics, so we get as much clear audio from Chris as possible. So Chris, on behalf of everybody with Team Beyond Pulse, thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. I'm going to get straight in now, and we're going to crack on with the rest of what we have planned. So for you, Chris, I'd like to take this in 3 different ways. A little bit as your life as a player, and just that portion of your journey, the transition then into management, and obviously now the sporting director role, and then to wrap up and conclude, advice to the young players on the line about what specifically you're looking for from the young players that you're responsible for working with now. And obviously we'll try and layer in any questions that we have. So my first one, I've opened this week with questions about inspiration. I would like you to try to name your all-time all-star 5-a-side team of players that you worked with, not necessarily just on quality, because I think we know some of the names that might get mentioned there, but a special characteristic about them that separated them. And Willow's about you were your leadership, your presence, how demanding you were bright. It was comforting to play behind somebody like you. So, in front of, sorry, never behind. Goodness me, you're behind people that have been in trouble.
I didn't track runners, so I was definitely never behind Chris.
But yeah, Casper, if you could, mate.
Well, Willow's got to be in the 5-a-side team then. After all that, I think that's what. Right. Okay. So my 5-a-side team, yeah.
Yeah.
In goal, I mean, it does. It is the obvious one. Is Peter Schmeichel. He was. We talk about a presence, and not just that. Peter really worked on his game. He wasn't just someone that was successful right from the start. When he first joined United, he didn't have the best of times, and worked hard with Alan Hodgson, the goalkeeping coach at the time. And the thing with Peter was he set really, really high standards. So every day in training, you had to be at it. Every warm up that he did with, before games and things like that, and obviously his performances in games were outstanding. So that was the thing about Peter. So he was, really the standards that he set, and the quality that he produced was fantastic. To be fair, I'll go 2 am I going to go 2 defensively if I got 2 defenders, Willow, or what do you think? I think I'll go one out and out defender.
There you go.
And I'll go an attacking defender. So I think probably the best defender in a 5-a-side would be. It's a small court, so I'm going to go for Dennis Irwin. Dennis was, 2-footed, read the game unbelievably well. Fantastic player going forward. He's probably more attacking defender, to be fair. But again, set really high standards. An unassuming guy who just got on with his work, was always available for training, always available for games. Performances always, high standards, whether he played right back or he played left back. Always contributed to the team going forward, and like I said, defensively, 1v1, he was fantastic. So I'd go, as an attacking one, I'd go Dennis. The out-and-out defender, probably the best defender that I played with was Gary Pallister. Gary was just head and shoulders above everybody else with regard to his physical presence. That's who I played with anyway. Gary was, unbelievable in the air, very, very quick probably over longer distances really. So like I say, five-a-side might catch him out a little bit, but he was technically very, very good as well. Great round his feet, and always looking to be positive. Possibly could have chipped in with a few more goals, but I think he scored a couple of big goals at Anfield in one season. Yeah. The what? Sorry.
They're worth 10 anywhere else anyway. One goal at Anfield for a United player.
That's all that matters. Yeah, that's all that matters. Midfield, I'm going to go for. We actually still play a few five-a-sides actually, and he's just unbelievable to play with. His Paul Scholes. Paul's just still very competitive. The five-a-sides we actually play together as me, Gary, Butte, Scholesy, Ryan, Phil. We play against for Gary and stuff like that.
What time that must be! Wow.
Yeah, it's for charity. We raise money for charity. So it's a privilege to play in that team really, and Scholes is fantastic to play with. Sorry, and it just is. I think the one thing about Scholes was his competitiveness, really competitive. He's not the biggest of guys or anything like that, but never got intimidated. His vision, his awareness, his passing skills, and the goals that he scored as well. Was unbelievable. And I'll go with Giggsy as well up top, because again, in those games he's very competitive as well. And I don't think you'd ever probably have Ryan down as throughout his career as someone who was ultra competitive like that. But competitiveness, it doesn't always mean going about flying into tackles and being physical and stuff like that. Competitiveness was a will to win, and Ryan had that in abundance as well. So like I say, all four of those players. So I've got that right, haven't I, Peter?
You've got it, mate. You've got it. Yeah.
Five.
Or have I not got? Have I
got it.
Oh no, I've got five. I was going to include Willow, but I might have to just leave that one now.
I'll be on the bench. That was a familiar position at United, so I'll.
What a boy. Well, Chris, I think it's safe to say that that's the best five-a-side team that we've had named in the last 2 weeks. So for the benefit of everybody that's on the line, I hope that gives a first-hand insight into obviously the caliber of player that Chris was fortunate to spend some time around, and again why the insight that we're so excited for him to share is hopefully so valuable to you guys. So Chris, thank you for that great start. I do want to ask from a personal perspective and blend into a question that Tom Bray you've shouted out on the line. You were obviously the captain of the England youth teams as well, and led your peers there. Can you tell everybody who's listening a little bit about the sacrifices and dedication that it took at a young age for you to get to that point? What was it that you thought you were conscious of doing day in, day out, the decisions that you were making off the field that helped you at that key stage in your career? Seeing that from the players around you, and obviously what was it with them at a young age that helped them kick on and separate themselves and form the careers that they did for themselves within the game?
To be fair, I think there was only one player, possibly two, who I ever thought from 16, 17 when we joined United that they had an unbelievable career ahead of them, and one was Ryan. Playing against Ryan when I was 12 and 13, he was just on a different level. The way he moved, the way he ran, the way he did it, scored, the way he got skill and all the rest of it, and it was just unbelievable to play with at such an early age. And you always knew Ryan was destined to have an outstanding career. Probably the other one was Wes. I think Wes again, when he was 12 or 13, he's more your age, I think, Willow. I always thought he was destined, and it was quite disheartening for me, because as a defender, you see this kid coming through and just knew how good he was. Yeah, those were the two, but definitely Ryan, you knew was going to be an outstanding player. The rest of them, even in the first year as being a being a 16, 17-year-old, Scholes, he never got in the youth team. David only played in the semi-final of the Youth Cup at Tottenham in March time. He just, physically just took off after, 6 or 7 months of struggling to get into the team. Gary was the captain. People say that he made himself what he was, and yeah, he definitely did. Mentally he was very, very strong. Probably a bit of a different character now to what he was back then, because I think he probably did need to have that. He was resilient at the time, but he was a good player, but he really, probably the penny dropped with him when he was 18, 19, that what he needed to do and to make himself the player that he was. And he was in between being a centre half and being a fullback, and I think it was Jim Ryan basically, nailed him down to being a fullback. He could still play centre half, and he played there once or twice, but he learned how to be a fullback. And obviously, when you've got the likes of Dennis Irwin and Paul Parker, they were really influential in probably his development. Nicky was a real strong lad when he was 16. Did the basics really well. Wasn't going to make you ooh and ah and be eye-catching with regard to being skillful or anything like that, but his desire and his will to win and his competitiveness took him on to have a fantastic career as well. And Phil was probably Phil Neville was, I think he was a bit of a victim of his own success, really, because Phil technically was, again, an outstanding player. And again, I think it was in your group, Willow, or the year around you, that he was 2-foot. He was a proper 2-footed player. He was quick. Going forward, he was very, very good. And the manager used him in 2 or 3 different positions, and he didn't really nail one position down, and it became a bit of as much a problem for him. But he was probably easy to leave out, because, like I say, he'd not actually got a specific position to play in. A one specific position, whereas all the rest of them were pretty much nailed on. Phil played as a left back, played as a left sided midfielder, played as a central midfielder. So he did move around the team quite a bit.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I just share something there, like Chris. When I think about my time there, so I was a little bit later than you. Obviously, I was 90, signed as a schoolboy in '94, and left in 2001. And when I look at your career and even John Curtis's career, to a point, you were kind of the talisman at England youth level. You were captains. You were touted as going to be, first team regulars, and you had all the talent. And for me, you had the character as well. Again, I said it earlier. I enjoyed playing in front of you because you were demanding. You give me a rocket when you needed it. You were composed. It settles players down when you've got that presence around you. And John was very similar as well. So when you think about that kind of meteoric, always upward curve that you and John and even some others have been on, could you pinpoint a moment and what it might have been that you felt in your head was, other than other players, was going to stop you being a first team regular? Because for a period, there was probably an expectation that you would become one. In your mind, what do you think that was? Was it did you feel it was a lack of games? Did you feel it was a lack of faith? Did you feel opportunity wasn't quite there? And how did you deal with that at the time when you maybe saw other players becoming regulars?
Yeah, so when you joined '94, I was part of the first team squad, and I played at Rangers in a pre-season friendly, played at Wolves, went to Ireland on tour with the first team, and I was kind of myself and Nicky possibly Keith as well, who were, been parting in and around the first team more than anybody at that stage. And then I think it was the first game of the season for the reserves. I twisted my ankle badly. I don't know if you were there or what, but we were training in the afternoon the day before the game, or a couple of days before the game, and I went over on my ankle. And it was a time when the manager was making it obvious that he was going to play the youth team players, or the young players, should I say, young pros, in the League Cup game against Port Vale. And I did everything I could to get back for that game, but I didn't do myself justice, and I probably wasn't right for a good few weeks after that. It wasn't right, and the lads that went in probably did themselves a lot more justice. So they kind of went on from there and got the momentum from there. And I had a few months where I was struggling with my form, struggling with my fitness. And it's probably a lesson for all young players to take that. You'll never play when you're 100% fit. You'll know that better than anybody. But there are times when sometimes you've just got to hang back a little bit and just take that extra little bit of time to recover and do yourself more justice. The extra 10 days sometimes can be far more beneficial than coming back too early and doing what I did. So it kind of, that 94, 95 season for me, where I was still in and around the periphery of the first team, but like I say, from the start of the season, I did struggle to hold any kind of, or keep any kind of momentum from a really good start. And David May had been signed. Ronnie Johnson was, I think, he'd just signed or was about to sign as well. So it's that's when it. I wouldn't say it was the injury full stop, but it definitely didn't help.
Chris, the insight's fascinating, and I want to blend this with a question that Dan you've asked on the line. Obviously, within that youth team, you were one of a handful that clearly had a high degree of potential. How were the coaches working with you, both to support you in transitioning to the first team, and then when it didn't quite work out, was there any special measures put in place from how the coaches kind of spoke to you, worked with you, what they demanded from you? Was there anything different? And were the coaches conscious of perhaps not over pushing or trying to change too much the skills and characteristics that you guys were displaying? Just curious as to how they worked with you on a day-to-day basis.
No, I think the secret behind the coaching was, it was very simple and basic. But that was it. There was no. I think it came from a set of standards that the manager set, and they went right the way through the club, and that included the coaches. That they demanded high standards from you. And if your standards slipped and your performances slipped, they were always there to help you, but they weren't going to come running after you. And you were treated like a man from being 16 years old. You were a professional in their eyes. You were doing a professional job in a professional environment, and you were treated like one. So I think, that's where I would start, that you had to help yourself. And what we would do in an afternoon, and even in the morning, we kind of changed the culture at United. There was a and it's been well documented that sometimes it was made to be a little bit uneasy for players, which it's going to be happening in all kind of environments, but it was going too far, and we changed that. We had some strong personalities in our dressing room, and we also created a practice culture that was in the morning, before training, in the afternoon, and we kind of carried that on. Some of us, when we became pros and we signed our professional contracts, we'd go and with the apprentices, Willow would be one of them, and the other lads, they'd be doing sessions in the afternoon with Eric Harrison, and myself and Gary and Phil and one or two others had asked to join in the session, and you were never turned down. So that was the thing about it. It was, you had to help yourself. The coaches would always be there and give you a guidance, but you had to realize and work it out for yourself that, if your performances weren't quite right or something needed working on, you had to go and work at it yourself. But if you did ask the coaches, you know, what you needed to work on, or you asked to work on specific stuff. Me and Gary used to work a lot on 1v1 defending, because, you know, that's as a defender at Manchester United, that's what you've got to be able to do. So it was about, you know, it was about, you know, self-assessing, helping yourself. You can't rely on coaches. And for the young players out there, don't think that, you know, if you're having a bad time, the coach is going to put his arm around you and sort it out for you. That's just not going to happen. And it never happened at United. There was a safety there that you could always speak to the coaches on whatever level, whether that was the first, even the manager. You know, you could go and see the manager at any time and ask him where you stood, and he'd always spend, you know, he'd always take time with you. You know, Brian Kidd, and we were fortunate to grow up with so many outstanding coaches. You know, Brian Kidd and Nobby Stiles and Eric Harrison and Jim Ryan. You know, these were, you know, great coaches who were always there to help and support you. But you had to do it yourself as well, and you had to go out and practice. And I think that's one thing that, you know, was really, I don't think, you know, they always say Cantona, when Eric came, his practice was unbelievable, and it was. But, you know, as young players, we were always practicing as well, and I think that's really important for young players.
Yeah,
one of my favourites was one of Gary's slide tackling sessions up on Wembley, Casper. That was always a lot of fun for some of the younger players. You ever remember doing one of those?
Yeah, we did a few of them at the back of the cliff. Yeah. There was no prisoners taken as well, Willow, and you know, that's how you've got to practice. You've got to practice how you play. But yeah, no, like I say, it was good that, you know, whenever you needed some more support and more practice, and that was always available.
I think people like, when you're comparing and contrasting coaching today, maybe coaching in the US to coaching in Europe as well, I always remember things being very simple. From Eric to Jim to Mike Phelan to Paul McGuinness, who would chip in every now and again, even Steve McLaren, the concepts that they were giving you were very simple. And you're right, they wouldn't seek you out. It was your responsibility to seek them out if you had a question to ask. Otherwise, the prerequisites were, you practice how you play. Working hard is a prerequisite. It's a running game, so you've got to be consistently at the peak of your fitness. And those things all come from those mental skills that you either develop or you don't. In our time, Chris, there was certainly nobody there to develop the psychosocial aspect. I think you either found that resilience from within, or you found that desire to want to work hard and practice and be challenged all the time, because it was, for me, the most challenging environment I've probably ever been in, the most demanding, the highest level, certainly from a performance perspective. But I agree, it's interesting when I think about how we coach now, and Tom, you know this as well from your time back in England coaching as well, that there's more duty of care to the player now, but I think there's got to be a line drawn in the sand at some point for the more elite players at the higher end of the game, and that then brings an accountability to them towards being responsible for the things I just mentioned and the things you talked about, Chris. You have to take accountability of your own development at some point and use the coaches as a resource to make sure that you're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, Willow, I think it's societal, where I think that the input that Chris has just given, and guys, I know a lot of you on the line are young players, but you've heard that, you know, I think, Chris, I'm going to build on your comment of you having to help yourself as a player and how it's kind of led to where you are now. But for any player listening now or listening later down the line, you've obviously got insight from two people who grew up in arguably the world's best football club. And you're hearing that the ability to be independent and to be accountable and be responsible for yourself is ultimately what's going to make or break you. Because if you don't put the work in, if you don't dig in and find opportunities to improve on your weaknesses, and as Chris said, find extra opportunities to challenge yourself, somebody else will. And if somebody else wants it more than you, and ultimately they're gonna get ahead. So, Chris, the insight that you've shared from your playing perspective is incredible, and it gives me, it flashes me back to, I said this to Willow, when I was obviously a young lad in England, and your generation were the first ones that I remember trying to break through at United. So thank you for the candor in how you've shared some of your memories. Obviously, as we said, it didn't quite work out, and from playing, you did transition to a new career, first as a manager and now as a sporting director. My question to you, based on the characteristic that you developed as a player, that ability to help yourself, that kind of resilience, that kind of tunnel vision to wanting to be better, how did that lead to you getting into management and now being a sporting director at Salford?
I think initially that resilience and that character gets built up from the leaders around you, and we had an unbelievable leader in Sir Alex Ferguson, where I think if you look at so many people that came through that system, and I don't mean players, I mean lads that actually didn't have go on to have great careers. Some lads went on to have great careers at other clubs, some lads who went on to have long careers but not at the same level, but you could argue that was a great career still. But I think what he instilled in us was a work ethic and a discipline that you look at, with all respect, you look at Willow now, what he's gone on to achieve. Had a good career, really good career, but now he's not stopping. And that gets instilled on you, instilled in you by the manager, I think, and it did with us at United, where I can think of loads of lads that didn't make it, in our year group, but have gone on to have really good careers in other industries and things like that. And a lot of them display the same traits, that they are relentless and they don't stop, and they have got a will to win. They do want to carry on learning, and they want to carry on improving, and it was born from me, from my family background, from my mum and dad, and was carried on from at work through the manager. So when I came to the difficult decision to retire from football at 26, it wasn't a decision that I took that took a long time over. I got to a stage where I knew I wasn't affecting the first team. I'd lost pride in myself. I'd lost my self-esteem, and I just got to the stage where I thought I was in the way and I wasn't actually earning the money that I was getting paid. So I just said one morning, I went and saw Alan Pardew, who was the manager at the time of Reading, and I just said, Alan, I can't do this anymore. And I'd got a bone graft that I needed to have on my leg. I was going to be out for another 10 months. I could have sat there on my contract, but I just couldn't do that. And I just made the decision there. I didn't speak it over with anybody. It was something that I had to do myself. And I made the decision on that morning, really. It wasn't something that had festered in my mind. It was just something that hit me, and it was like, so that's what happened with that. And, before then, I'd started to get into coaching. I'd done my prelim badge. I don't know if I did it with you, Willow, actually. I did it with a group, because we were in the Youth Cup final when the lads were all doing their prelim badges, but we didn't do ours at that time. So I went back and when I was about 18, 19, and did my prelim badge, my first coaching badge, and then, like I say, when I finished playing, I went straight to Bath University, where I'd been doing some rehab work, because I live near there. And the guy who was running he was the director of sport, a guy called Jed Roddy, invited me to do some coaching with the university team and a team called Team Bath. So, like I said, I didn't hang around for long. I knew what I needed to do and what I wanted to do, and that was to get straight back into work. And I've always enjoyed that kind of the tactical side of things, and kind of being a bit of an on-field coach, really, and talking through games, because I was never the biggest, I was never the quickest, I was never the strongest, but I had to do something that helped me in my game, and that was reading the game. I was technically okay, and I had to organise, like Mark says, people in front of me to help me do my job. So I went, like I said, straight into coaching from there. And then we were quite successful at the university, but I was living quite away from home, so I decided to move back home. And I was fortunate to get the youth team coach's job at Bury when I was 27, 28. And then when I was 30, the manager of the club got sacked, and I was asked to take over in the interim whilst they found a new manager. And within that period of time, I got together some really decent results, and they offered me the job, and I was there for 2.5 years. It was tough because we've got no money financially. We were probably got the least biggest budget in the division, but I enjoyed the challenge. And young players that came through that system. Mark Pugh now is in the playing the Premier League. Dale Stevens is still in the Premier League. We brought Casper in on loan, that's probably playing the Premier League. And other lads like Nicky Adams and David Buchanan that's gone on to have unbelievable long careers, 500-600 games. I had to play the young players, and I got a real buzz out of that because I'd developed young players. I'd developed those players myself. So I really enjoyed that side of the coaching side, but definitely the work ethic and the standards that you'd like to set within your day, whether that's as a coach or that's as a sporting director, definitely comes from the mentors around you and the people that have led you in the past.
Hello, do you want to? I'm curious of carrying on before I let you ask the question. Do you want to?
No, I think Chris is very humble about obviously the transition and what he ended up being. I think for those on the line, Chris became, I think you were the youngest manager in the entire football league when you took over at Bury, which showed, I think a level of maturity beyond your years, because there's not a lot of trust from boards in the professional game in England for youth, and we're about to jump on a panel this afternoon, Tom, about age is just a number. But you mentioned something really key there, Chris, and you said you were an on-field coach, and you were. And you said you weren't the biggest or the quickest. I don't know if I've got team photos in the first team, but you're not 6'1", 6'2" that I remember. You're not 6'2". I think
no,
he is.
I was only 5'11", maybe 6 foot, touching 6 foot. And
see, there's the thing for me. You had a bigger presence on the field, and I think that was because of your character. So for me, it always felt like I was playing in front of somebody 6'2", 6'3". It's amazing what character and how you showed it on the field can actually make others around you feel, in terms of security, in terms of wanting to play with people, in terms of enhancing you as a player. So yeah, that's an interesting point. I didn't realise you were only 5'11", 6 foot, Chris. I always had you pegged to 6'2", 6'3", mate.
No, I wish I was 6'2", 6'3". I might have had a longer career. The gaffer might have played me in a few more games.
Chris, I'm going to go off this, and Mark, you and I have spoken about this obviously offline a few times, but you both had to leave what is arguably, the most successful club and team culture that's ever existed in our sport. You both had to leave there, and you transitioned to a place where, perhaps elite wasn't your everyday. Maybe standards weren't as high. So I've two questions. One, Chris, how did you find that transition? And you've spoken to your character being, what drives you, and that your personal standards won't slip based upon what was instilled in you from a young age. But can you talk to me a little bit about the challenge that you faced, or maybe still do face, with Salford in your role, where you're not around elite players who perhaps never experienced the same level that you did? Maybe their standards or their expectations aren't quite as high, but how you're conscious of trying to instill the same drive and mentality that was put into you into them.
Yeah, I went to Bournemouth in '96 on loan. I went to Swindon in '97 in the Championship on loan, and then I finally signed for Reading in '98 after going there on loan. One thing that I did struggle with was the standards, really. The dressing room. I think at United it ran itself. you know, if anyone's standards dropped, it wasn't the manager that jumped on you, it wasn't the coach that jumped on you, it was everybody else. You know, and I just got the feeling, and maybe that was just me, I don't know, but it wasn't the same, and I did struggle at times to fit in at Reading. I think I wasn't particularly bothered about that. I had my own standards, but you know, that was difficult to begin with because the club was in a real transition, and you know, I was signed by an outstanding coach in Tommy Burns, who, you know, God rest his soul, he's a real good man, very real good coach. And I didn't think he got the support of the players that he deserved either. So, you know, that was a difficult time for me. To leave United was the right time for me. There's no question about that, because I was 22, 23. I'd played probably hold the record for the number of reserve team games, I think, or something like that. I'd played too many. I needed a career, and you know, when Reading came in for me, it was a good move for me on paper, but probably wasn't the right one for me culturally and, you know, for me personally. But listen, that's hindsight, and you know, you play the hand you dealt, and you get on with it. So yeah, that transition from United to another club was quite difficult. Now I'm fortunate that, you know, the standards that we've got at Salford, and you'd like to think, you know, you play your part in developing those standards and that culture, where we've got a manager that sets a real high standard in Graham Alexander, who played over 1,000 league games. You know, you don't play until you're 41, and you don't play in the Premier League when you're 39 and 40 if you've not been able to look after yourself, if you've not got the self-discipline to be able to do that. Graham's got other staff around him, Chris Lacchetti, his assistant, and Carlo Nash, who had great careers as well. And, you know, we'd like to think that the choices that we've made, and that's one of the roles of being a sporting director, you have to make the right decisions in recruiting players, but also, as well, most importantly, recruiting staff. And we've got that. I think we've got a real high professionalism that, if I was a player coming into that, would I enjoy it? And that's what I always benchmark against. And yeah, I would. There's no question about that. The standards that we've set, I think, are very, very high. And obviously, with the club being owned by the owners, you know, the class of '92 as well, I think that instills a standard in itself as well. And Gary Neville's, you know, the main or the lead owner, should I say, as far as financial is concerned. I think, you know, I think it's all split up evenly and whatever. But Gary's really the most vocal, and the one that I work with most closely out of those guys. And obviously, we all know about the standards that he set. So it kind of, again, going back to what I said about Sir Alex, it does cascade its way through the club when you've got leaders that do want to set those high standards, you know, and develop that culture that, you know, is a learning one. Everyone wants to learn, but has got the desire to want to win, and hopefully we've got that.
Yeah.
Can I elaborate just a little bit, Chris, on what I'm hearing? Everything you say, it screams like it's simplicity. We talked about coaches back at United in the mid 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. Everything was simplified. But I think there's a misconception that simple is easy. Like, we talk about discipline, we talk about habit forming, we talk about behavior, talk about being on time, being respectful to your teammates, being respectful to the staff, engaging with them. That's not the, you know, out on the field trying to beat some of the best defenders in the world, or whoever you faced against one-on-one to try and create an opportunity for somebody to score. We think about those things as simple concepts, but they are difficult when you talk about consistency in behavior and habit. So to do those things, to be disciplined every single day, is difficult. To self-discipline yourself around nutrition, sleep, self-improvement, you know, all of these things that are considered simple, and not the X's and O's, not the tactical concepts and methodologies that are considered more complex. For me, this is the simplest thing to get right, but the hardest thing to do consistently. resilience, that relentlessness. It takes a lot of mental strength to continuously do those things every single day. And that's what I'm getting from what you're saying, Chris. There's a lot of simple ideas and concepts in place, but there's a lot of resilience and relentlessness and mentality towards driving high standards and high performance every single day, and that is a very difficult thing to do and build.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with a lot of coaches who I've seen in the past, and possibly a lot of young coaches, is to talk too much. I think they commentate too much. I think I know Sir Alex got asked a question, when he's giving a team talk, how he keeps how important it is that he keeps his message to 100 words. And actually, he turned it round and said that it's more important you keep it under 10 words, because after that, players will switch off. And that's the difficulty of a coach, is because things are not going quite right. I think they take it a bit personally, and they need to intervene. They need to say something. They need to try and fix it. No, let players have a go. Let players learn. The problem with coaches, and the problem in this day, is that there seems to be this thing about players have to react to the coach. They have to they have to develop at such a rate and all the rest of it. Back in our day, like I say, with Scholesy, with Becks and all, you were given time. You were given time to make mistakes, and if you made mistakes, you had to learn from them. You had to learn from them quick. But there wasn't a lot of this hairdryer and this Eric Harrison temper wasn't very rarely seen. You knew it was there, but it sometimes the most powerful thing, I think, for a coach is body language and the words that you say. And there was two things that happened to me as a player. One, I did something really not great, and I let myself down on the training ground. And the manager, Sir Alex, he didn't give me the hairdryer. He didn't shout and scream at me. All he did was, and I knew I'd let myself down. I knew it wasn't great. I'd had a couple of bad touches of the ball, and he just said, but he made sure I heard it. He just went, "Oh, it's poor that." And then the effect it had on me had far more an effect than him turning around and saying, "Casper, you're rubbish. That's rubbish. Don't do this. Try this." And it had far more effect. And the other time was I did something really well. Year later, it took a year to do something well, but something in training, and he just went, "Oh, what a great pass!" And it meant so much to me. He didn't say it to me face. I just heard him say it. He went, "Oh, it's a great pass, that." And it's those little things, those little nuances of a coach. That's what you've got to try and get into your work, I suppose. Not saying too much, because you gabble on and all the rest of it, and it loses its effect. And two, like I say, if you carry on doing the same old things, it becomes boring. And so with Eric, you were always wondering what he was thinking. With Nobby, it was the same. The manager was the same. He'd always be there at training. He didn't say a lot, never said a lot, but when he said something, it meant something. I think that's the most important thing as well for a coach.
It's a powerful motivator, silence, at times, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, I think it comes a lot from the insecurity of the coach. When things aren't going quite right, it's kind of like, "Oh, I need to fix this." No, players will fix it. Young players, especially. I think the problem comes with older players. They struggle with a bit with the self-esteem and making mistakes. Young players don't. Young children, if they're doing something and they don't succeed, they'll carry on doing it, and they'll carry on doing it. As we get older, we seem to think that it starts to become a slur on you. It starts to affect your self-esteem. You start to worry about what people think about it. Young kids don't do that, and we've got to try and recreate that as much as possible in our coaching, that allows older players and adult players to try things and be secure in a way that, in an environment that is challenging, but at the same time they are afforded the opportunity to to try things and to to express themselves. Definitely.
Yeah, Chris, it's such valuable insight, and again, I think it resonates even more when both of you are able to share first-hand experiences of how it impacted you as a player. Chris, I'm very, very conscious that obviously we've gone past an hour. I do know we had some technical difficulties, so I'm gonna be conscious of your time, and I'm gonna wrap it up with a final question that's targeted towards a little bit of advice for players. And I'm gonna ask this because, Willow, some of the things that you mentioned earlier about character, I have here that you said it's an easy thing to get right, which I agree with. I would also flip it and say it's very easy things to get wrong, because all it takes is one little bit of peer pressure and conforming to it, and things start to crumble. So Chris, in your role as a sporting director, you said you're responsible for looking at players that you want to bring in to help you and obviously the team of staff that you have in place achieve the goals that you've set out for the organization. So could you tell me, touch upon, if you could, like, what do you look for from those players? What is it that's a really positive example? Things like the quality of warm-ups, things like an appreciation that their training intensity, regardless of who is watching, is always sky high. Their standards are always sky high, because we use the phrase, you never know who's watching. You never know when might be the time that you're being watched by, especially on this side of the Atlantic, college coaches. Maybe a scout is there at a game for you. So just from that perspective, could you close with some advice to the players that are on the line?
Yeah, I think what you say is right, Tom, about you never know who's watching. And you should always practice like that, even if you're practicing on your own. Create scenarios where you should always practice at match intensity if you can, and that doesn't mean if you're doing a shooting drill, you run back to your mark or anything. You take your time, but once you're actually in the drill, then you've got to do it at match intensity, because that's what practice is, and that's the only way you're going to improve. I think on what you say there about young players, like I said, the going back to the practice, just I think it's important that everything that they do, and you look at that when we're recruiting players for Salford, we do a lot of background on their character first and foremost. We do a lot of background on their social media, because if they're coming out with all kinds of nonsense on social media, the chances are that they're the kind that could actually have a bad influence and put the club in a bad light as well. And the exposure that our club gets, we wouldn't accept that at any club, but obviously the club that we're at as well would be even worse. What I want to see from a player when he comes in: can he hold a conversation? Can he look you in the eye? Have they got that willingness to work and get pushed? And in this day and age, these players, they've all got the GPS monitors and heart rate monitors, and we've got to be careful that we've got a good sports science department. We've got to be careful that we don't take away the fact that players not only can be pushed, but actually want to be pushed. I couldn't think of anything worse than a sports scientist telling me to finish training. Could you imagine that? Couldn't think of anything worse. You'd get told where to go in non-certain terms, and you're in the red zone for this, and well, good, yeah, I've been in the red zone. What's wrong with that? It's going to make me better, So that's something that we look for, that character. You look at the previous clubs, the previous record. We try and get 3 or 4 references for every player, and you're not always going to get a set of angels, and we don't want angels. I think a good team is made up of different characters, different backgrounds, different personalities, but the one trait that you want them all to have is that high level of standard and that work ethic. And I think if you can get that, If you can get that right, and I think we're on the right tracks at Salford. You know, we've got a really good squad of players. It's taken a bit of time to gel, but I think we're well on the way to you know, to having a good squad together, and you know, hopefully we can keep on getting that right. You don't get everything right as a, you know, in recruitment and as a sporting director and all the rest of it, but I think if you can have your main principles, and you know, when you are recruiting players, these are the things, and staff as well, these are your main principles, your work ethic, your trust, what they're going to be like in the relationship and the culture within the club, then you're well on the right way, right track.
Yeah, well, Chris, I think it's clear for anybody who's listening that based on the conversation that you've shared with us today, that it seems uncertain that anything other than success for you guys. So listen, Chris, on behalf of obviously Willow, myself, Team Beyond Pulse, everybody that's been in of this line on this call, everybody who's going to watch on demand, thank you so very much for the insight from the trip down memory lane, for the top tips within the role that you currently sit in and the lessons that you learn along the way. It's been wonderful, and I only wish that A, we had more time, and B, there wasn't the technology troubles that we had at the start. But I'm very mindful of you sharing a lot of your time with us already. So again, just a big thank you, and all the very best to the challenge ahead of you at Salford. Willow?
No, massive thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. A lot of depth and insight there, and you know, a lot of food for thought for our players on the line, for coaches on the line. And I urge you to watch the Class of '92 documentary and anything you can find on Salford City and the growth and development of that club. It's a fascinating story, and one that's quite inspirational, but should give you hope as a player or a future coach or a future sporting director like Chris has become. A lot of insight and knowledge can be found from just researching and having a look at those two entities.
Stuff. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity, guys, and you know, if there's anything else in the future as well, it'd be great to catch up again. But good luck, everyone, and all the very best, and stay safe.
Top man. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.